With the guns finally silenced in 1945, a new and different confrontation took shape: the Cold War. The globe was effectively split between two dominant powers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. They would not meet in open-pitched battles. Instead, they waged a prolonged contest of ideas, influence, and military deterrence. Both sides amassed enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons, and the question of how to control, threaten, or avoid their use would become central to international politics. From Stalin to Reagan, from the nuclear arms race to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from the Berlin Wall to the wars of Korea and Vietnam, this is the sweep of the Cold War. In the wake of World War II, Europe was carved into two spheres. The Soviet Union, having endured nearly 27 million dead, moved quickly to install friendly communist regimes across Eastern Europe, creating what would be called the Eastern Bloc. As Winston Churchill would later put it, an iron curtain had fallen across the continent. The United States, flush with wartime production, and the only nation to deploy atomic bombs, emerged as the leader of the capitalist world. Tensions flared early. Stalin's retention of Soviet forces in Iran and his pressure on Turkey over the strategic straits alarmed Washington. In response, President Harry Truman announced a policy to resist Soviet expansion, the Truman Doctrine, dispatching military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. This strategy of containment became the backbone of American Cold War policy. Seeking to shore up Europe against communist appeal, the U.S. also launched the Marshall Plan in April 1948, funneling roughly $13 billion in aid to rebuild economies and promote open markets. Germany quickly became the most visible symbol of the split world. After occupation, the Soviets controlled the East, while Britain, France, and the U.S. administered the West. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was similarly divided. In June 1948, Stalin sealed off all land routes to West Berlin in a bid to force the Western powers out. Rather than withdraw, the West organized the Berlin Airlift, sustaining the city by air for 15 months until the blockade was lifted. As tensions hardened, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. To counter Soviet influence, Western nations created NATO in 1949, a collective security alliance led by the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe. In Washington, the CIA expanded rapidly after 1947, growing personnel, overseas bases, and budgets. Over the next few years, the agency intervened covertly, where nationalist movements seemed susceptible to communist influence, most famously in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954. Actions that installed pro-Western regimes and earned the agency a controversial reputation. Events in East Asia broadened the Cold War into a truly global contest. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in China, founding the People's Republic of China. The United States responded by bolstering Japan's economy and supporting French forces fighting a communist insurgency in Vietnam. Then, in 1950, North Korea invaded the South. Guided by the domino theory, the fear that one communist takeover would trigger others, Washington committed large numbers of troops to repel the offensive. The Korean War slogged on for 3 brutal years, ending in a 1953 armistice that left the peninsula essentially divided along the pre-war line after over 2 million dead. Crucially, Korea demonstrated that communism could be militarily checked, shaping U.S. policy for years to come. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power and soon organized the Warsaw Pact to balance NATO. Khrushchev's volatile style, public bluster, sharp rhetoric, and occasional eccentric gestures made him a startling figure on the world stage. By 1961, Khrushchev was determined to stop the hemorrhage of skilled East Germans fleeing to the West via Berlin, roughly 2.7 million defections since 1949. When President John Kennedy refused to withdraw from the city, Khrushchev ordered the sealing of East Berlin. On the 12th of August, 1961, what began as barbed wire barriers rapidly evolved into a fortified concrete wall, 12 feet high, nearly 100 miles long, patrolled by armed guards and even minefields. The wall stood as a humiliating symbol of Soviet repression. Meanwhile, Kennedy faced another crisis in the Western Hemisphere. After Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution in Cuba, Havana pivoted away from U.S. influence and toward the Soviet Union. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Castro using exile forces, collapsed within days, embarrassing the Kennedy administration and convincing Moscow of the need to protect the Cuban regime. In 1962, the USSR secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, US. Reconnaissance discovered the sites, and Kennedy responded with a naval blockade, a quarantine to prevent further Soviet deliveries. American forces were placed on high alert, and Florida became a staging ground with large troop concentrations ready for an invasion if ordered. For the first time, nuclear war seemed a near possibility. A tense face-off at sea nearly spiraled into catastrophe when Soviet submarines encountered United States ships enforcing the blockade. One submarine's captain prepared to launch nuclear torpedoes, but the launch required agreement among the officers aboard. Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize the strike, an act that likely averted nuclear war. On October 28, a negotiated settlement ended the crisis. The United States promised not to invade Cuba, and the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles. The episode left an indelible mark on both capitals. A direct channel, the Washington-Moscow hotline, was later established to prevent future misunderstandings. The conflict's next major theater was Vietnam. For years, the United States had supported South Vietnam against the Communist North. Following Kennedy's assassination in 1963, President Lyndon Johnson escalated American involvement, convinced that withdrawal would signal weakness. The war deepened and became hugely unpopular at home. By 1968, mass protests, led largely by politicized youth, swept across the United States and other Western countries. The intensity of domestic dissent contributed to Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. United States forces would remain for several more years before a partial withdrawal, and in 1975, North Vietnam ultimately overran the South. The human cost was staggering. More than 58,000 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese combatants, and millions of civilian deaths across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union itself was undergoing change. Khrushchev was removed and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, whose era was marked by bureaucratic stagnation, corruption, and declining living standards in much of the communist bloc. The Brezhnev Doctrine hardened Moscow's posture, suppressing dissent with military force when necessary. Seeking stability amid global unrest and domestic protests, United States President Richard Nixon pursued a different tact détente. Beginning informal talks in the late 1960s, he and his counterparts negotiated arms control measures, notably the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, aiming to cap intercontinental ballistic missiles and slow the nuclear competition. Détente eased tensions for much of the 1970s, but the Détente era frayed in the late 1970s as the Soviets deployed SS-20 intermediate missiles in Eastern Europe and then invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The 1980s brought a renewed confrontation under Ronald Reagan, whose rhetoric cast the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Reagan nevertheless framed his approach around a paradox: build up Western military strength to force the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into concessions peace through strength. A signature element of this strategy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, an ambitious plan for space-based missile defense. Reagan calculated that by pushing advanced, computer-driven programs, the United States could outpace the Soviet Union's technological capacity, compelling Moscow to negotiate from a weaker position. The strategy helped create the conditions for negotiations, and in 1985, Reagan met a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Facing economic stagnation and rising unrest across Eastern Europe, Gorbachev launched policies of perestroika and glasnost to modernize the Soviet system and reduce political repression. He also recognized that the arms race was a crushing drain on the economy. Between 1985 and 1988, Gorbachev and Reagan held a series of summits that gradually built trust. Their talks culminated in the INF Treaty on the 8th of December 1987, which committed both sides to eliminate an entire class of short and intermediate range missiles, a pact that ultimately led to the destruction of some 2,500 warheads and increased on-site verification. Yet the reform currents Gorbachev unleashed soon gained momentum beyond Moscow's control. In December 1988, he announced significant reductions in Soviet troop commitments to Eastern Europe, effectively signaling the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine. With the Soviet military no longer an instrument for crushing challenges to communist rule, reform movements across the Eastern Bloc accelerated. In 1989, a cascade of largely peaceful revolutions toppled communist governments across Central and Eastern Europe. The most emblematic moment came on the 9th of November 1989, when the Berlin Wall, the symbol of division, was opened, and people streamed between East and West. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself unraveled. By 1991, it dissolved into 15 independent republics, bringing a surprisingly rapid and relatively nonviolent close to a host of tensions that had dominated world politics for more than 4 decades. If this video helped you, consider subscribing to the channel and commenting on what topic you'd like to see next. I'm Jhon, watching the past to understand the present. See you in the next era.